Ethan Grant had always been a man who saw the world differently. While most people were content to follow the rules, to walk the well-worn path laid out by generations before them, Ethan had always looked up at the sky and wondered, why not? He was the type of person who saw a mountain and immediately thought about what was beyond it, rather than the view from the top. His mind was constantly spinning with ideas, theories, and experiments that most people would call impossible. And yet, somehow, he always found a way to turn the impossible into something tangible. The year was 2041, and Ethan had just made the discovery of a lifetime. He had unlocked the secret to controlling gravity. Well, not exactly controlling gravity in the sense of stopping it, but manipulating it on a quantum scale. His discovery, his masterpiece, was the creation of miniature black holes. Tiny, nearly weightless singularities that could alter the gravitational field around them. He could make things levitate or fall faster, or in some cases, disappear entirely, as if they'd been sucked into a void. Ethan's lab, an old converted warehouse in the heart of Silicon Valley, had become a shrine to his work. The walls were cluttered with scribbled equations, half-finished prototypes, and coffee cups that hadn't seen the inside of a dishwasher in weeks. The floor was scattered with papers, books, and leftover pizza boxes. The place smelled like stale coffee and burnt rubber, though no one ever dared complain. To Ethan, it was perfect, and he had a companion, of sorts. Her name was Rachel Summers, a colleague from his university days who had stuck with him through thick and thin. Rachel had always been skeptical about Ethan's experiments, especially his obsession with black holes. She often told him it was reckless, dangerous even, but she never left. She was drawn to his brilliance, his passion, and perhaps even the chaos that seemed to follow him everywhere. On that fateful Tuesday afternoon, Ethan was working on his latest experiment, something he'd been tinkering with for days. He was trying to stabilize a black hole the size of a marble. He'd already created several small ones before, but each time, the results had been, well, unpredictable. The problem was that once you created a black hole, you had to control it. If you didn't, it could grow. And if it grew too much, well, let's just say the consequences wouldn't be pretty. But Ethan wasn't worried. Not yet. He had the controls figured out. He'd perfected the equation. The black hole, he reasoned, was just another physical object. All it needed was a little fine-tuning, a few adjustments to the gravitational pull. A nudge here, a tweak there. Gizmo, he said aloud to the tiny black hole that floated above his workbench. He had named it after the little gadget his father had given him when he was younger, an old handheld game console that had become a comforting relic of his childhood. Gizmo was tiny, no larger than a marble, but it pulsed with an eerie light. It was his creation. His achievement. Rachel stood across the room, arms crossed, watching Ethan's movements with an expression that was part curiosity, part concern. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice tinged with the familiar skepticism. "Last time you tried this, you nearly pulled half the lab into another dimension." Ethan grinned, tapping his fingers on the table. "It'll be fine. I've adjusted the parameters this time. Everything's under control." Rachel rolled her eyes, but she didn't leave. Ethan had that effect on people who couldn't quite decide whether they were fascinated by him or terrified. Rachel was no different. As Ethan leaned in to adjust the controls on his terminal, his wrist brushed against a sensor. The black hole shifted slightly, growing a fraction larger, a slight ripple in the fabric of reality. It didn't seem like much, just a brief flicker, but then it happened. The black hole began to grow. At first, Ethan thought it was just a glitch, a fluke. But the black hole kept expanding, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The lab started to tremble. The walls groaned under the pressure of the immense gravitational force. Bookshelves tilted and fell over, papers were sucked into the air like they were caught in a windstorm. Rachel's eyes widened in horror. "Ethan! What the hell did you do?" Ethan's hands flew across the controls, but it was too late. The black hole wasn't just a marble anymore, it was the size of a beach ball, then a car, then a small building. And it wasn't stopping. "Oh no," Ethan muttered, the color draining from his face. This isn't supposed to happen. The black hole was no longer just floating above his desk. It had become a force of nature. The whole building was shaking now, its foundations cracking under the strain. The machines around Ethan began to short-circuit, sparks flying, screens flickering. The sound of metal bending and snapping filled the air. "What do we do?" Rachel screamed, her voice rising in panic. Ethan could barely hear her over the deafening roar. He stumbled back, trying to keep his balance, but his thoughts were racing too fast for him to focus. The black hole was growing at an exponential rate. Whatever he had done, it wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was a global disaster in the making. He looked at Rachel, fear in his eyes. "We need to get out of here. Now." As they ran toward the exit, the building itself seemed to bend around them. The doorframe twisted, then imploded as the gravitational pull of the black hole sucked everything nearby into its depths. Ethan felt the air grow thinner, and his heart skipped a beat. The black hole wasn't just pulling in physical objects, it was distorting time itself. Suddenly, they were outside, standing on the pavement, looking back at the warehouse. But it wasn't just the warehouse that was affected. The entire city seemed to tremble. Streetlights flickered, windows shattered, and cars ground to a halt, as though they too were caught in the black hole's influence. People were running, shouting, but their voices sounded muffled, like they were underwater. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the growing abyss. The black hole wasn't just affecting the lab, it was eating away at the entire city, and it was expanding faster than anything he could control. What had started as a small, manageable experiment had spiraled into a nightmare that threatened to consume everything. Rachel was beside him, her breath shallow and ragged. "Ethan, this is real. We need to stop it." "I know," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't know how, but I know I have to fix this." But as they watched, the black hole grew even larger. It was no longer just a threat to their city. It was now big enough to swallow the entire planet. Ethan stared at the swirling mass in front of him, the black hole's edges distorted by the atmosphere, as if reality itself was warping under its pull. The city around them was in chaos. People were screaming, running in all directions, but their efforts were futile. No one could outrun the force that was pulling them toward the center of it all. "Ethan." Rachel's voice was a distant shout, but she was right next to him. He felt the panic rise in his chest again, threatening to swallow him whole, just like the black hole. "I need to fix this," he said, his voice tight with fear. His mind was racing, scrambling to find a solution, to find anything that could stop the catastrophe from unfolding. But the truth was, he had no idea where to even begin. The black hole's influence was beginning to distort time around them. As he glanced around the streets, he saw glimpses of things that weren't supposed to be there. A car that had been flipped upside down earlier now righted itself, a streetlight that flickered on and off like it was trying to communicate something cryptic. It was as if the rules of nature had lost their grip, and nothing was quite as it seemed anymore. Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm, snapping him out of his trance. "What do we do?" she asked again, her voice full of urgency. "How do we stop it?" "This is your fault, Ethan. You're the one who created this." Ethan flinched, guilt cutting through him like a hot knife. He didn't need Rachel to remind him, he already knew the weight of his actions. His creation, his brilliant idea, had gone horribly wrong. It was eating everything in its path, and the more he stared at it, the more he realized that the black hole wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was a living thing, a force of nature that he had unknowingly unleashed into the world. And now, it seemed unstoppable. I have to go inside," Ethan said suddenly, his words slipping out before he had even fully formed them in his mind. Rachel looked at him in confusion. "Inside? What are you talking about? You can't just walk into a black hole." "I have to," Ethan replied, his voice steadying as he began to realize that there was no other way. "The only way to stop it is to reach its core. If I can get to the heart of the black hole, I can reverse it. I can collapse it before it grows any larger. Rachel shook her head, her eyes wild with fear. You're insane. You're talking about going into a black hole. It's impossible. But Ethan was already moving, his steps driven by an overwhelming sense of purpose. The black hole was calling to him now, its gravity pulling at him like a magnet. He could feel the distortion in the air, the pressure building with every passing second. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he knew he was the only one who could fix this. As he walked toward the center of the black hole's pull, everything around him seemed to slow down. The world was warping in strange ways, the sky above him stretching and folding in impossible patterns. Time was becoming unreliable, but Ethan pushed forward, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, minutes, hours, but he didn't care. The black hole was his responsibility, and he had to make it right. Rachel caught up to him, her face pale but determined. You're crazy, but I'm not letting you do this alone, she said, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. Ethan gave her a brief nod, not bothering to argue. He had no time for doubts. He couldn't afford to waste a single second. Together, they moved closer to the event horizon, the edge of the black hole where everything seemed to vanish into a void of incomprehensible nothingness. The closer they got, the more distorted everything became. The ground beneath their feet began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The buildings around them started to warp, their outlines bending and twisting into impossible shapes. People were screaming, but their voices seemed to come from a distance, muffled by the warping reality. Ethan and Rachel reached the black hole, and it loomed before them, a swirling mass of dark energy, its center pulsing like a living heart. Ethan could feel the pull, a physical sensation, like his very atoms were being tugged apart. Every instinct in him screamed to turn away, to run, but he knew that was impossible. The only way to survive was to confront the black hole, to undo the damage he had caused. We have to go inside, Ethan said again, though this time his voice was quieter, more certain. Once we're inside, I can reverse the flow of gravity, collapse the singularity before it consumes everything. Rachel didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, taking a deep breath. Her hand reached out for Ethan's, gripping it tightly. Together, they stepped into the black hole. At first, it was like stepping into a vacuum, a place where all sound and sensation disappeared. It felt as though they were falling, but not in the way they'd expect. There was no ground beneath them, no up or down, just an endless stream of light and darkness that moved around them at impossible speeds. Time became irrelevant. It was as if the very fabric of existence was being shredded and reassembled with each passing second. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea where they were, or what they were meant to do next, but he couldn't stop now. He had to reach the core of the black hole, to find the point where everything began and collapse it before it grew any larger. Then, something unexpected happened. A voice that was faint at first, almost a whisper in the vast emptiness, but as it grew louder, Ethan realized it was coming from him. It was his own voice, but it wasn't speaking words. It was speaking memories, memories he had forgotten, things he had long buried. Faces flashed before his eyes, moments from his past, his failures, his regrets. It was as if the black hole was showing him his life, unfolding in front of him in an endless loop. The voice grew louder. And then, it spoke directly to him. You thought you could escape, Ethan. You thought you could control the universe. But you cannot outrun your own mistakes. The words chilled him to his core, and for a moment, Ethan wanted to turn back. The black hole had become something more than just a scientific anomaly. It had become a force that was pulling at the very fabric of his being, a force that understood him in ways he didn't understand himself. No, he whispered to the darkness. I can fix this. I have to fix this. The voice laughed softly, a sound like the rustling of leaves. Fix it? There is no fixing what has already been done. Time is collapsing, and there is no going back. You wanted power, Ethan. Now you will see what it costs. Ethan's stomach turned. He couldn't let this voice, or whatever it was, distract him. He focused on the pull, the gravitational forces that twisted everything around him, and then, as if by instinct, he reached out. He felt the singularity before him, its infinite density, its infinite power. He closed his eyes, letting the pressure build around him, and in that moment, he understood. To reverse the black hole, he had to collapse it from within. He had to rewrite the event, change the course of history itself. His heart raced as he focused all his energy on the task. He didn't know how, but he had to. The universe was waiting on him to act, and then, everything stopped, the swirling chaos around them faded, and for a moment, there was stillness. Absolute silence. Ethan opened his eyes, and what he saw was beyond comprehension. The black hole was shrinking, collapsing, folding in on itself. Time reversed. The reality around them began to return to normal, the city outside slowly rebuilding itself, as though the black hole had never existed. Ethan and Rachel were standing back in the same street they had started from, as if nothing had happened. The world was still intact. The sky was clear. People walked by, oblivious to the chaos that had nearly consumed them all. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, but then, as they stood together, Rachel finally looked at Ethan, a soft smile on her face. "You did it," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. He didn't know how he had done it, or why it had worked, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The black hole was gone. And with it, the guilt, the fear, the uncertainty. He had fixed his mistake, but as he turned to leave, something nagged at the back of his mind. There was no way to truly undo the damage, no way to know how deep the ripples of his actions would stretch across time. Still, for now, he had done what he could. He had saved the world, and maybe, just maybe, he had saved himself. The world, once again, felt normal. The rush of the city around them, the hum of distant traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, it all returned with a sense of comfort, so much so that, for a brief moment, Ethan wondered if it had all been a dream. Maybe the black hole, the chaos, the fear, it was all just an illusion. But the weight in his chest, the exhaustion that clung to his every step, told him otherwise. Rachel was silent as they walked down the street, side by side, neither of them speaking. It wasn't that they didn't want to, there was just too much to say, too much that had happened in such a short span of time. Words felt too small to encapsulate the magnitude of what they'd experienced. And maybe, just maybe, it was easier to leave the silence to settle between them. Ethan caught sight of a newsstand ahead, the headline on the largest newspaper striking him like a punch to the gut: Global Black Hole Event. Is Earth's fate truly secure? He stopped in his tracks, staring at the paper as if it might come alive and call him out. What if it wasn't over? What if the black hole still lingered in some forgotten corner of space? Or worse, what if something worse was coming? He didn't have answers, and neither did anyone else. Rachel stopped beside him, following his gaze. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the same headline. "You know, there's going to be a lot of questions now. A lot of people who want to know how we stopped it, why we stopped it, and, I don't care," Ethan cut in, the words falling out before he could stop them. "I don't care what people think. What matters is that it's over. We stopped it." Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She knew better than anyone how deeply Ethan felt about his work, his need for validation. But this time, he didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want the accolades. He just wanted peace. He'd spent so many years searching for answers, solving equations, chasing scientific discoveries that, in the end, had almost destroyed everything. "There's still a lot of loose ends," Rachel said after a beat, her voice quiet, but serious. "This isn't just about you and me anymore. There are consequences. There's more to this than what happened in that lab, Ethan. People are going to want to know how a black hole came to be in the first place, why it didn't just collapse on itself right away. Why it almost destroyed the planet. And why, you were the one who unleashed it." Ethan flinched at the last words. It wasn't the first time Rachel had mentioned it, her voice always holding that edge of frustration, but it cut deeper now. He had tried so hard to convince himself that it wasn't his fault, that the black hole was simply a result of forces beyond his control. But no matter how much he reasoned, the truth was undeniable. He had created it. They continued walking in silence for a few more blocks, the city bustling around them, but it felt as if they were in a different world. People rushed past, caught up in their daily routines, while Ethan and Rachel were walking through a reality where every step was uncertain. The air was thick with the unspoken, and for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to confront the world outside of the black hole. He had hoped, after everything, that they would return to some semblance of normalcy. But as the buildings around them rose higher and higher, as the sun shone overhead, he realized that what they'd faced had changed everything. He had changed everything. His mind was still in a fog, trying to make sense of it all. His lab was gone, vaporized by the black hole's gravity. His work, his greatest achievement, erased. The people he'd called colleagues, people who had once admired his brilliance, had likely moved on, moved past him. They would ask questions, demand explanations. Some would think of him as a hero, others, a fool. But no one could ever understand the true cost of what he had done. No one could ever know what it was like to hold the weight of the universe in your hands, to feel that pull, that desperate urge to control something so vast, and then watch it slip out of your grasp. Rachel nudged him lightly, snapping him out of his thoughts. "You're zoning out on me again," she said with a soft smile, though her eyes were still filled with that familiar concern. "You okay?" Ethan turned to her, giving her a tight smile. "Yeah. Just thinking about everything." "Well, don't think too much. It'll drive you crazy," Rachel said with a half-laugh, shaking her head. "We did it. The world's still here. We're still here. That's what matters." Ethan nodded slowly, but the words felt hollow. The black hole was gone, yes. But was he truly free? Could he ever go back to the life he had before? His work, his research, his obsession, it had led him here. To this moment. To this reckoning. The truth lingered, a weight he couldn't escape. Maybe there was no going back. Maybe there was no fixing the past. But still, part of him clung to the hope that he could move forward. That he could live with what he had done and find some kind of peace. "Ethan," Rachel said, her voice softer now, as if reading his thoughts. "You don't have to carry this alone. You're not in this by yourself. We can figure this out together." He turned to her, meeting her gaze for the first time since they had emerged from the event horizon. The weight in his chest lightened just a little. He didn't know if he could fix everything. He didn't know if the world would ever look at him the same way again. But he didn't have to do it alone, and that, in itself, was a small victory. They reached the corner of the street, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan stopped. He looked around, taking in the city, the people, the world that was still turning, still moving forward. It was as if the earth had simply shrugged off the black hole's existence, moving forward without a second thought. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something akin to relief. He had faced the worst, he had stopped the end of the world, but the world, in its infinite resilience, had carried on. "I think we should head back," Rachel said, breaking into his thoughts again. "Maybe we can grab a coffee? Get some fresh air? You know, pretend like everything's normal." Ethan chuckled, the sound shaky but real. "Yeah. Normal. For now, I think that's enough." And so, as they walked away from the chaos that had nearly consumed them, the world outside kept turning. The streets were alive with the usual bustle, the sounds of everyday life. For Ethan, it was the first time in a long while that he felt like he could breathe. Maybe there was hope after all. Maybe, just maybe, he could still find redemption in a world that had almost been lost. As they walked, side by side, the weight of the black hole seemed to lessen, the echoes of what could have been fading. There was no going back to the past, no undoing the mistakes. But as long as he kept moving forward, As long as he kept breathing, there was a chance for something new, and that, for now, was enough.